equipping you to navigate your grief journey after child and sibling loss. This is the Hope After Child and Sibling Loss podcast. On each episode, we explore the many challenges of grief as guests share their stories of loss. It's also a place where you'll hear about God showing up in our darkest moments and restoring meaning, purpose, and hope to shattered lives. I'm Greg Bufkin, your host and one of the co-founders of the Empty Chair Endeavor. To learn more about us, please visit our website at www.emptychairendeavor.com. Hey, and welcome to another episode of the Hope After Child Loss podcast. I'm Greg Bufkin, and thanks for joining us. My guests today are Brad and Jill Sullivan, founders of While We're Waiting, a nonprofit organization offering free biblically based retreats for grieving parents all across the U.S. After losing their sweet, beautiful daughter Hannah to a year-long battle with a glioblastoma, Brad and Jill understand the unspeakable trauma of losing a child. Jill is also the host of the very successful While We're Waiting Hope After Child Loss podcast. And yes, we will be talking about that name similarity. So now here's my conversation with Brad and Jill. Well, Brad and Jill, welcome to our podcast. It is so good to have you guys today.
It's an honor to be here. We thank you for having us. And
yes, thank you.
We're grateful.
Absolutely. The honor is all mine. And I do want to clarify something for our listeners because you guys have this incredible podcast called While We're Waiting, Hope After Child Loss. And the name of our podcast is Hope After Child Loss, the Empty Chair Endeavor. So I think it's just kind of funny that we ended up with a very similar name, and our podcast host site, Buzzsprout, didn't seem to catch that. But it's okay because God continues to bless both of our endeavors.
Absolutely. And like I've told you, ours is a subtitle. Yours is the title.
Right.
Ours is a subtitle.
Right. Right. So is everybody listening completely clear on that?
As I was thinking too, the hope we have is in Jesus, and I don't think anybody has a corner on the market of the Bible in the gospel. So that's something we all can claim as our own. So that's what we're doing.
That's absolutely true. Yeah. So thank you for calling that out, Brad. If you've listened to our podcast at all, you know that at the top of the conversation, I always give my guests a couple of minutes or so just to share anything personally with our listeners that we might not have covered otherwise. So the floor is yours.
All right. Well, we're Brad and Jill Sullivan, and we live in Hot Springs, Arkansas. And we met in college and got married in college and went to graduate school and got our master's degrees and started our career in education. I was a teacher and then an administrator. Jill was a speech pathologist, and God gave us two incredible daughters, Hannah and Bethany, and we just loved our family and still do. But we traveled around. I was a school administrator, so I would move from an assistant principal to a principal. Then I ended up being a superintendent. So our girls, they embraced our moves in education around Arkansas, and it was just we've had a blessed life, and our family loved education and loved being around education, and my girls were very involved in school, and they didn't mind it that their dad was the principal.
Well, that's not always the case, I'm sure.
But they embraced that, and there was days that it was hard, but for the most part, they didn't mind it that their dad was principal. Hannah for sure, and then Bethany, there was times that might have got old to her. I don't know.
Did either of those girls ever have to pay a visit to the principal's office?
Actually one did, because my Hannah allowed someone to copy off of her, and the teacher wrote them up. And so they both got to come to the office. And so Hannah got whatever the handbook said she got. So yeah, she did come one time, but they always loved to come after school, and
Sure.
It was a safe place to come to Dad's office. And so it was a blessing too. They wasn't sent to the office very often. So
they chose to go to the office.
Yes.
That's right.
I think that's pretty cool that, sometimes kids grow up not really knowing exactly what mom and dad do. They hear about it, but they never get to see it. So I think that's really cool that they wanted to go to your office, Brad, and just, see what it is that a principal does other than deal with bad kids.
They defended me with their classmates and other students at times.
All right.
So I always said, Dad, I had to tell so-and-so to be quiet. They don't know what they're talking about. So it took up for her dad too.
Good.
They both did.
Yeah. Good daddy's girls.
Yes.
That's right.
And Jill, you were a speech pathologist. How long did you do that?
Oh, goodness, 20 years probably. And the funny thing was I worked in the school system too.
Yeah.
And so I was there also. So we basically were together 24 hours a day with our kids, which was really fun.
Wow, that is cool. That is so rare,
Yeah, in a small school district. So, one of those districts where everyone knows everyone and just like a family, a big family.
Yeah.
And so it was a great time. We really enjoyed that.
It's a good thing that you guys really love each other and like being around each other.
That's right.
Yeah, and I can kind of identify with this setting because my wife, Kathy, is a retired school teacher. So, yeah, I've been around the education world a lot as well. Yeah. And it sometimes can be interesting when one of our children was in the same school where Kathy taught, and some of those stories that I got to hear at the end of the day when our son may or may not have been called into the office. And then
right.
Kathy had to get a phone call about that at the end of the day and address that with one of the headmaster or the assistant. Well, guys, I want you to tell our listeners a little bit about your sweet daughter, Hannah. I shared in the introduction that you guys lost Hannah to a glioblastoma back several years ago. Some listeners may not know what that is. If you guys if you both want to take turns, that's absolutely great. But tell our listeners a little bit about that. But I also just want people to know who Hannah is.
Sure. Yeah, we love to talk about Hannah.
Of course you do.
You understand.
I do.
Yes. Well, she was our firstborn, and she was very much a firstborn personality type of kid. And I like to kind of talk about her in regard to the things that she loved. One of the things that she loved was American Idol. She absolutely loved watching the show. She would, we would basically structure our lives around the American Idol episodes. She would vote for her favorites.
Wow.
Faithfully after every episode. I always say Carrie Underwood owes all of her fame to Hannah Sullivan because she's probably the one that put her over the top. She also loved school. We talked about that a little bit with her dad being there, but she was a very motivated student. She always wanted to be at the top of her class. She had plans to be the high school valedictorian. She just really had set that as a goal and was very focused on that. She took a lot of pride in her academic achievements, probably a little bit too much pride, but that's just who she was. She loved our family. When we would have, when it was a special occasion, her birthday or something like that, she didn't want to invite friends from school. She wanted her family to be there, her extended family, her aunts, her uncles, her grandparents. She loved nothing better than a family gathering of everyone together. That just made her so happy. So she loved her family. And then she loved the Lord. She came to know Jesus as her Savior when she was about 8 years old, came walking into our living room after she had been put to bed for the night. And, that was kind of a rule in our house. After you go tucked in, you stayed in bed. Well, she got up and she wanted to ask Jesus into her heart. So she got down on her knees in the living room and asked Jesus to be her Savior. And she really walked out her faith, very active part of our youth group at church, went on mission trips and things like that. And she just had a very strong faith walk of her own. And we're really proud of her for that.
Man, I mean, there's really no words to attach to describing when your child comes into a relationship with the Lord, when they ask to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just to say it delights us is such an understatement. Man,
Absolutely.
what a blessing. So I'm so thankful for that. She sounds like she was maybe an overachiever.
Very much so. An overachiever and a perfectionist.
Yeah. Yep.
Said firstborn child.
Yeah, that's pretty descriptive of first children, isn't it? Yeah. And it kind of made me laugh a little under my breath when you were talking about how your Hannah loved school because, having parents who both were educators, of course, I know that made you very proud. By contrast, Ryan, on the other hand,
Hmm.
that was probably not his favorite thing in the world was
Sure.
school. So I was just thinking, he went through school because he had to, and he learned some things in the process.
Sure.
But
Probably enjoyed the social aspect.
yeah, oh, he did very much so.
Hmm.
Very much liked entertaining other people, which he
Sure.
carried into adult life. But our daughter is our firstborn, and sounds like she and Hannah had a lot in common.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I'm sorry, you guys go ahead.
Oh, that's okay. In her sophomore year of high school, everything was going along great, our family life was just incredible. And Hannah, on Valentine's morning of 2008, woke up with a severe headache and was sick to her stomach. And, you figure it's a bug, sent her back
Right.
to bed. She didn't go to school that day. She woke up that afternoon and she felt fine. But that continued for the next couple of days. She woke up in the morning with just a severe headache, sick to her stomach. And, it was just kind of mysterious what was going on there.
So there was no lead up to this at all. It was just suddenly
No.
one morning.
Yeah, very suddenly one morning.
And she's about 16 or so at the time?
She was 16 at the time. That's right. She eventually did go back to school, and because, she wanted to be the valedictorian,
Of
didn't want
course.
to miss school. But she called me from school one day and she said, my headache is still kind of there. I really don't feel that well, but all of a sudden I have double vision.
Oh, gosh.
And I said, okay, well, that's it. I'm coming to pick you up. We're going to the doctor. And she said, oh, no, let me finish out the day. We'll talk about this when I get home. So when she got home, I looked at her, just really looked into her eyes, and I noticed that her pupils were very enlarged. And, that alarmed me. I knew that was not normal and with the double vision and all that. So we got her into the doctor's office the next morning, and the doctor looked at her. He really couldn't figure out what was going on with her. And he said, because she's got these vision issues going on, I think we need to refer her to an ophthalmologist. And so we said, oh, of course, let's do that. So he referred her to an ophthalmologist who happened to be practicing in our town. And when he gave us the appointment card, we noticed the name that was on it. It said Thomas Mosley. Well, we had gone to college with a guy named Tommy Mosley who had sung at our wedding, and we had lost touch with him through the years. Well, turns out that's who we were referred to.
Oh, you're kidding.
Yeah, I mean, that's just God working ahead of time,
Yeah.
just putting the right people in our paths. And we brought her in for that appointment, and you actually were the one that brought her in that day and kind of got reacquainted with Tommy. And he looked at her, examined her, and he said, I really can't tell what's going on, but if it were my daughter, I'd want her to have an MRI. And he made us an appointment for an MRI the very next morning. I do think he had a suspicion that what we were looking at was something very serious. And so I brought her in that next day for the MRI, and, she woke up that day and she felt fine. It was the first day she had felt well in the morning in a long time. And I almost was tempted to cancel the appointment because I thought, whatever this was, it's better. She seems to be okay now, but,
Sure.
Tommy had made the appointment, so I thought, well, we better follow through. Brought her in for that appointment, and, I could tell something was going on by the way the technician was acting.
Yeah.
She actually came out of her booth in the middle of the MRI, and she offered me 2 tickets to go have lunch in the hospital cafeteria. She said, when this is finished, before you leave, I want you and Hannah to go have lunch in the cafeteria and then come back by just to make sure that we got everything that we needed. And when she said that, I thought, this seems odd, but that's what we did. After the MRI was over, she handed me those tickets and she said, I really want you to go have lunch in the cafeteria. Come back by and we'll talk again, before you leave. So, that mom radar is kind of going off.
Oh, I bet.
But, we went down and had a very hurried lunch in the cafeteria. Then we came back in, and when we came in, she had pulled the chairs together and she had us sit down, and she said, your ophthalmologist called and he's on his way over to talk to you. And then, of course, I knew. there
Gosh.
was something there. Sure enough, Tommy was there within just a few minutes, and he told us, he said the MRI shows that there's a brain tumor. And he took us in the technician's booth and he actually showed us on the screen. And so I could see it right there in the middle of her brain was this large white mass. And, Tommy was wonderful that day. He prayed with us. Of course, Hannah and I both started crying.
Yeah.
Asking questions. And he was so kind. He answered the questions that he could. He said, I don't know. I don't really know what this is, but we will have them ready to receive you at Arkansas Children's Hospital first thing in the morning. Go ahead, go home tonight, get your things together, and be at Children's Hospital by 8:00 in the morning. And he actually walked us out to the car. And, I got in the car and started driving, through my tears. And Hannah's asking me questions. What does this mean? Of course, one of her big questions is, are they going to have to shave my head?
Of course. Yeah.
She told us, she's going to have surgery. All the questions that a 16-year-old girl would have. And I didn't know the answers. I did call him and I said, Brad, I need you to come home. And that's all I could say, because when I cry, I can't talk.
Yeah.
And I just hang up the phone, and we pulled in the driveway and there he was waiting for us.
Brad, when you got that phone call, what were you thinking?
Well, I knew that there was something I needed to be home real quick. So I got home in a hurry.
Yeah.
And things were, as a dad, I was thinking, what's going on here? That my mind was going fast, and, just the thoughts that was going through my head. And so I get home and I'm in the driveway when they pull in and park, and Hannah gets out of the car and she looks at me and she says, Dad, I've got a brain tumor. And I remember those words and how it really took the air out of my lungs. I couldn't breathe.
Can't imagine.
And then I'm thinking, how we're going to fix this. And, we got inside in our house, and I called my neighbor, who's a retired pastor, and we bought a house next to him and his wife. They become like our girls' adopted grandparents. So I said, Brother Gerald, can you come over? And he was there real quick.
Yeah.
And he prayed with us, and he gave us a verse that Nahum 1:7, the Lord is good, a refuge in times of trouble. He cares for those who trust in him. I remember him praying, and then we prayed together as a family. And that Philippians 4:7, the peace that passes all understanding, we started to experience that. I've heard that, but I experienced that at that time. And so we started making phone calls and making plans to go to Children's Hospital. And but our lives changed really quick then.
I think it's very interesting that a minute ago, Brad, you said, how are we going to fix this? That is how our dad brains work.
That's right.
We protect, we defend, and we fix. And, when you're facing something like that, you suddenly realize that I don't have the power to fix this.
Right.
But you know who does.
Amen. And I know we as a family consciously made the decision, God, we trust you. We don't understand this. We don't have the answer, but God, we trust you. And that is what gave us peace as we started this journey that we're about to embark on.
Yeah. And I thought it was interesting too that you said that you knew about God's peace, but it was maybe the first time that you really experienced God's peace at a level that you had never known previously. And I can relate to that so strongly, because it was the same for me after we lost Ryan, because I had about a 3-hour, almost 4-hour drive home with Kathy after we got the news. And I thought, I don't know how I'm going to do this. But it was like when we got in the car, this peace that just absolutely made no sense whatsoever.
Passes all understanding.
The scripture could not be more accurate when it says that.
Yeah.
And
Amen.
I'm so thankful for it, because otherwise I don't think we would have made it home.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So you've got this news that no parent wants to hear. And so what do you do at this point? Because when you hear brain tumor, unfortunately, a lot of times our minds go to the absolute worst when it has something to do with our child, right? And so how are you guys processing this at this point? Because you still don't have, all you have is a general answer, but you don't have any specifics. So you don't know whether it's malignant. You don't know whether it's benign. Is it operable? List of questions goes on and on and on, I'm sure.
Right. And, thankfully, we didn't have to wait long to get to the hospital. We went the first thing in the morning. I'm sure, it's been many years now. I'm sure we laid awake that night and, thought about all of those things. But, we knew we weren't going to get the answers until we got to the hospital and had her looked at. And, we got there and they put us in a room immediately. And first thing they did was another. And, now I know what they were looking for. They did her brain and her spine. They were looking to see if it had spread anywhere. Thankfully, it had not. It was contained just to the one tumor in the brain. And they started talking to us about, okay, we're going to be doing surgery. And they said what they would do is they would open her up. They would go in through the back of her head, not have to shave her completely. That made Hannah very happy. Just shave a strip down the back of her head. They would go in, they would get a piece of the tumor, they would biopsy it to some degree on site, which would tell them whether they needed to go in and take the whole tumor or whether they could just close her up and do radiation. We heard all that. I'm not sure we processed it completely, but she did go in for surgery just a few days later. And it's a terrifying thing to send your child in for brain surgery because you don't know, how they're going to come out. Is she still going to be Hannah when she comes out?
Yeah.
Are they going to will there be damage done in there that's going to leave her with lifelong disabilities?
Yeah.
We didn't know, but we were so thankful they were able to go in. They did have to take the whole tumor based on what they saw in that initial, little mini biopsy. And when she woke up, she was still our Hannah.
Oh.
They were able to, without causing any damage in there. There were some vision things, but we could live with that. And then she was actually released from the hospital within 3 or 4 days. She did remarkably well, but we knew we had to return to get the results of that biopsy.
Yeah. And how long did you have to wait for that, Jill?
I think it was about 5 days, 5 or 6 days.
Probably 5 of the longest days in your life.
Oh, yes, absolutely. But, we really felt good because she had come through surgery so well. We thought, this is going to be okay. And I'm a speech pathologist. I thought, whatever I can help her with things and, we'll get through this. And, but we came back in for that appointment where we were going to meet with our surgeon and talk about all the post-op stuff and find out what the biopsy showed. And, we walked in and it was kind of one of those dreaded little room experiences. There was our surgeon and then there was another doctor and then there were some other people that we kind of found out later were like counselor types because of the news we were about to get. But our surgeon talked to us about some post-op stuff, and then he introduced us to the other doctor who was an oncologist. And he's the one who told us that the biopsy showed that her tumor was a grade 4 glioblastoma brain tumor. We had never heard the word before, didn't know what that meant. He said, don't go home and Google glioblastoma because you won't like what you read. He said she is young, 16 years old. She's healthy. Otherwise, we're going to do radiation and chemotherapy and we're going to battle this thing. And we feel like, we have a good chance. And that's what we heard. And we actually made a decision together that we would not Google glioblastoma based on what he said, because we wanted to trust the Lord in knowing that she was in his hands and that, we didn't want to be influenced or swayed by what we might read on the internet, because, you can read all kinds of things on the internet about anything medical.
Of course.
That kind of makes us sound maybe like irresponsible parents.
No, not at all. Not at all.
We just wanted to trust God with that. It was not long after that you might remember that Senator Ted Kennedy was diagnosed with a glioblastoma.
I did not realize that was what he had.
That's right. And it was all over the news. You could not listen to the news without hearing that glioblastoma is the most aggressive and deadly form of brain cancer. It was reported over and over and over. And I think that's part of when it first began to sink in what a serious thing that we were dealing with. We were very careful to protect Hannah from hearing any of that as much as we possibly could. But they recommended a series of radiation and chemotherapy, and we did all of that. And she did remarkably well for about 7 months. We would go in every 2 months and have an MRI, and every time it was all clear. And we were so grateful. We had an army of people that were praying for us. I kept people updated every day through emails. This was before podcasts and, all of that kind of It was before texting. It was before social media, really. And so we kept people updated by emails. And so we had so many people praying, and we really felt like things were going amazingly. And they were. But in September of that year, this was still 2008 at that point, she started having some symptoms that were eerily similar to what she'd had at the beginning, the headaches, the nausea, some balance issues. And so I called. She had had an MRI just 6 weeks earlier. There was one scheduled for 2 weeks from then. But I called her nurse and I said, something doesn't seem right. We're seeing some things that are troubling. And they said, go ahead and bring her in and we'll scan her. And when they did that MRI, it showed that the cancer was back, and it was on her brainstem, and it was all up and down her spine.
Oh, my.
The doctor called us in the next day, and the four of us were in there together. Bethany did this whole journey along with us. I don't mean to leave her out because she was an important part of this entire year journey. The doctor told us that she had less than a 5% chance of survival with the recurrence. And from that point on, we continued. He recommended a different kind of chemo, a different kind of radiation, a very harsh type of radiation. And we did all of those things. But she went to heaven just about 3 months later on February 26th of 2009. She did share a very special thing with her dad one evening at the hospital bed.
Before surgery. And this really kind of set our year, gave us purpose and direction for the year that was approaching us right before surgery. Hannah shared with me in Children's Hospital, and Jill had gone home for rest. And she said, Dad, I've got to tell you something. And so she went on to tell me about her youth group had just had a retreat, a weekend retreat. And she said, Dad, the leader shared with us how God allows storms in your life to bring you closer to him, and also to allow others to see him through your storm. And then she went on to explain, Dad, our waters have been calm. We hadn't had any storms. But I want you and Mom to know that I prayed for a storm that God might use me. And that was comfort to us, that God had prepared her and was preparing her for whatever was coming. And as we think about that year and what got us through that year, obviously when her health deteriorated, we understood the totality of a glioblastoma. We were grieving her, but we were also holding on to that hope of, a miracle. And we knew God could heal her. And so we were trusting her. But the way that Hannah walked that year, it was such a encouragement to us, because her personality, she was kind of, there's things she worried about grades in school, or she worried in Arkansas, we have tornadoes. If we had a tornado warning, she was concerned. And she never, throughout that year, she never feared, and she never said, why me? And she accepted those news when they said a less than 5% chance of survival. She accepted that with grace and without fear. And that wasn't her. That was back to God in her and what God was doing in her life. And so that's what really, we had a desire. We didn't want to waste that storm. And we were, Hannah she shared on her Facebook account the night before we went to the hospital, I'm going to Children's Hospital in the morning. I will praise him in the storm. That was before she noticed the storm story. So she accepted her storm. And I can say that as her principal and her dad, I am very proud of her legacy of how she's impacted me, her dad, and her mom and her sister. It changed our lives, and also how God is using it going forward.
I'm kind of short on words right here, y'all. I hardly even know what to say. What an incredible gift that she gave to you guys when she shared that with you, Brad.
Yes.
And the testimony that she walked out for, through what most people would have just not been able to handle, that kind of news, because it's devastating news, especially to parents.
Yeah, I remember one time in particular, we got one of those bad scans, and, we were emotional. Jill and I were emotional because, we saw what was coming, and she looked at us and she said, Mom and Dad, I'm okay. I'm good. And that didn't come from her. That was God and giving her peace in and through that. And that was, and she is okay.
She's better than okay.
Amen. Yes. And this, back to that hope we have. I'm okay too. Now I'm grieving, but I have hope. I grieve with hope.
And that's the difference. That's the difference.
Yes.
In Jesus, we grieve, but we grieve with hope.
Amen.
And it doesn't destroy our joy either, because the joy is not happiness, it's joy. And that's a whole different animal than happiness, because joy is not dependent upon the moment.
Right.
Or circumstances.
Or circumstances, exactly. You know, guys, this brings up part of an aspect of grieving that some parents never experience. And that is, you guys, in a lot of respects, started grieving almost a year before you actually lost Hannah. Ours was sudden. I don't know what that's like, but I know that there are people listening today that they might be right there where you guys were when they got that news. Maybe they just lost a child to something very similar, where they have that grief journey started before they lost their child. Could you guys just talk a little bit about how you navigate grief when you know that it's coming, but it's also present, if that makes any sense whatsoever?
Yeah, it does make sense. I've referred to it before. This is a Johnny Erickson Tata quote: "A bruising of a blessing." It was a bruising of a blessing. It was excruciating to watch her leave us little by little. You know, the cancer was in her brain, so eventually it began to affect her cognitively. It affected her ability to care for herself. You know, we had a 17-year-old daughter that we had to help with every basic skill, you know, you can imagine. And that was devastating and very difficult to observe, and to see her leaving us little by little.
Yeah.
Every day. And so there was a lot of grief associated with that. On the other hand, we had the opportunity to say all of the things to her that we wanted to say. And I believe she understood us, you know, even all the way to the end, at least to the last day or two. And someone like you know, that loses a child suddenly doesn't have that opportunity. And so that was a huge gift, to be able to, you know, say all of the things that we had on our mind. It was also a blessing. It was incredibly difficult to be there with her when she died, because it was actually and I've talked about this on my podcast recently, a rather brutal ending. I'm not going to share any details because that's private between us.
Right.
But I'm so thankful we were there for that.
Yeah. I'm thankful you guys got to be there.
Don't have that opportunity. And so that was a gift, a difficult gift, but a gift nonetheless. And, you know, it felt like we had probably cried all of the tears we had to cry before she died. And then we found out after she died, we still had more tears to cry.
Yeah. Sometimes it feels like they are never going to stop, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. So there were some beautiful things about it, being able to kind of pre-grieve like we did. And I feel in many ways that we are more fortunate than some who lost their children suddenly, because we had that closure. And then, you know, I talk to parents all the time that are like, oh no, I wouldn't have wanted to see my child suffer, you know? So it was for them a blessing to lose them suddenly, not a blessing, but, you know.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
It might be easier to have lost them suddenly.
Yeah.
There is no good way. There is no easy way.
No,
and
there's
so,
not.
you know, I think God knows what we need. And for us, we needed that more drawn out goodbye.
Sure. Well, I mean, can you imagine if God had given you the choice? What that's a lose-lose for a parent. I mean, you know, so yeah, I think He knows us so well that He knows for us and our child which is best. Guys, something that's difficult for parents sometimes is, you know, the fact that you guys know as well as anybody, men and women grieve very differently. So moms and dads, therefore, grieve very differently. And while we all know that there's no right or wrong way, sometimes when our mate grieves differently than we do, it can leave us questioning, are they really grieving? And I think that especially happens when a wife is observing her husband who grieves in a very different way, maybe because he's dealing with his grief by trying to stay busy, doing projects, diving into work, that sort of thing. So how did you guys walk your own individual grief journeys, because you have to, but at the same time give each other the grace that each needed individually, but still being able to grieve together?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think we got some experience with that even while we were walking out the journey with Hannah, because again, we were grieving then, not to the level that we were after she died. But one of the things about walking a child through a cancer journey is that it's very important for the parents to be on the same page with regard to treatments, because you have to make lots of decisions when your child is going through cancer about which hospital are we going to go to? What kind of treatment are we going to do? Do we discontinue this? Do we try another one? What about hospice? There's lots of decisions that have to be made. So it was very important that we be on the same page throughout that journey. And I think that served us well after she died. We do grieve very differently. And what's funny about us is that I might grieve more typically to what a man grieves, more privately and less tears, where Brad is the more emotional and vocal one in our relationship. And so we've had to give each other grace for that and just understand. And we knew that about each other because we just are, we're very different in just in our nature. And so we knew that even before losing Hannah, that we deal with things very differently. And what would you say about that?
Yeah, I think that's something that God gave us. We were having to really connect throughout Hannah's illness and beyond. And I think that we sought other parents out real quick that had lost children.
Yeah.
I mean, within a week or two. Mm-hmm. And so we wanted to talk to other people, both of us, that were ahead of us. And so, and the reality too, that God had put people in our lives that had lost children before we knew that we were going to lose Hannah. And so we sought those people out, and we watched them. As we looked back, we could see how they were walking the journey. And I can remember a conversation we had real quick with a couple, and it was somebody I worked with and went to church with, and they lost their little girl. And I was just broken because we had prayed for her, and we had visited her in the hospital, and she was 6 to 8 months old, and she went to heaven. And I was it was hard, but I got to see them walk this out. And I remember going to them and said, "How are you doing this?" And they looked at me and they said, "It's Jesus." And I know that's the Sunday school answer, but we knew that Jesus was our answer in our grief and in our hope, and Hannah had already modeled that for us too, in the way she lived out her last year. And so that was, for that we're grateful. But we started seeking people out and seeking community of grieving parents early on. And they were a blessing to us.
The community in times like that is so critical, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I'll say one more thing about the marriage issue is, there's this myth out there that 80%, 90% of marriages fail after the loss of a child. And that is actually not true. And that was based on, it wasn't even a study. It was an opinion that someone made that was put in a book somewhere. And that became the standard. 80 to 90% of marriages fail after the loss of a child. That is not true. All of the studies, the actual studies that have been done, actually do not indicate that at all, that marriages are actually a little bit more likely to stay together after the loss of a child. With one caveat, I've heard Ron Deal, who's with Family Life Ministries, say this: whatever direction your marriage is going when you lose a child is basically probably the way it's going to continue to go. If you have a strong marriage, if you have a healthy marriage, and then you lose a child, your marriage is probably going to stay together, again, with God. If you are already struggling and you're already kind of going your separate ways in your marriage after the loss of a child, you may follow that same trajectory, and it may even increase after the death of your child. So we always just try to encourage people. You may be struggling in your marriage. You absolutely have to be very intentional about giving your spouse grace, because you are going to grieve differently, and you've got to be okay with that. But don't assume that the loss of a child is the death knell of your marriage.
Amen.
You have to fight for it, but you've got to be willing to fight for it and not just think, oh, well, we're going to, studies say 90% of marriages fail. Don't do that, because that is not true.
Yeah.
Fight for it.
Yeah. Because sometimes something can become sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
That's
I
right.
am so glad you brought that up, Jill, because I try to share those statistics as well, because I don't want somebody who's in that early, very acute stage of grief, who just feels like, they're losing their mind, they've lost their child, what else am I going to lose? I want them to know that if whatever value there is in statistics, those statistics support exactly what you said, that most marriages survive far better than the statistics for the average divorce statistics that you always hear about. And I appreciate you talking about the origins of that misinformation, because you're absolutely right. It wasn't a study.
Right.
But the actual studies support about a 12 to 16% divorce rate, which means about a 86 to 88% chance that you're going to stay together. But again, it's about the foundation that you have going into that situation.
Yes.
And I think that is such encouraging news for parents who already have enough on their plate to deal with.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Thank you for letting me slip that in there.
Oh, listen, I am so glad that you slipped that in there. I think it's so important. Guys, I've heard this kind of thread throughout our conversation, but y'all, is there anything that you have learned about God on your grief journey that you either didn't know before or it became more reality on this side of losing Hannah?
For me, the concept of the sovereignty of God became so much more real and actually became a great comfort to me. Psalm 139, 15 and 16 says that he formed us in our mother's wombs. Every day ordained for us or every day was ordained for us before we even came to be. For me, I got a lot of comfort in knowing that Hannah's cancer was not just some random accident, that it was just something crazy that happened, but that even that was under God's control and was not without God's knowledge. And to me, that was a huge comfort, was being able to rest in the sovereignty of God. I've heard a quote that the sovereignty of God is a pillow that we can rest our head upon. And me, that was very helpful.
Yeah, I understand that completely. How about you, Brad?
Yeah, obviously the sovereignty of God, and then for me, that the eternal hope we have, what's ahead of us, and we look at the scripture, and God's going to redeem this broken world that has death and has illness and has all the brokenness of this world, and that's going to be redeemed. And just to focus on what's ahead of us, and also to rest in, and we can rest in Him, and He provides us protection. And I think that something that really stood out to me in the grief journey was that there is a spiritual battle going on.
Oh yeah,
the enemy is lying to us, and he's trying to tell us, no, there's not that eternal hope. You're just a random act here. You're just here, and and that's just the lie of the devil. And just identifying spiritual warfare, and the fact that the hope I have, and I can hold on to. What do I know is true? Back to that Psalms verse, 139. The hope we have in eternity. There's so many scriptures we can go to there. That's something that I really hold on to. But this being understanding the enemy is after us.
Well, the enemy will lie to us and try to tell us that it was our fault.
Of course.
Or that we missed something, or that we should have done something differently, or we didn't raise them right, or we didn't eat the right things when we were pregnant, or all of those things are lies of the devil.
Yep.
And we don't need to let him have a seat at our table.
That's right.
And you can tell when he's lying when he opens his mouth, right?
That's right. Yes.
Yeah, I know. We dealt with a lot of that too, Jill. Yeah. So I know. Yeah, you're right. He does come after you with stuff like that. And if you're not careful, you can start believing that stuff.
Right.
So
and when we're grieving, we're especially vulnerable to believing that stuff.
Yeah. That's one thing that is so glaring about being in that early acute stage is the vulnerability aspect of it
Yes.
in so many ways. Y'all, I want to spend a few minutes having our listeners get to hear about your ministry. You guys founded While We're Waiting. I love the name. And then you guys do retreats all over the country, and you do a lot of them, and you've been doing it for a long while. And Jill you have a very successful podcast. So tell our listeners a little bit about those things.
Sure. Like Brad said, after Hannah died, we sought out people we knew had lost children so that we could have some hope that we could survive. I remember those early days thinking, I can't live like this for the rest of my life.
Right.
I need to talk with some people who have lost a child and have survived and are thriving. And so we tried to seek out those people, and we were so encouraged by talking to them that, they just gave us hope that we could make it. And then we heard about a retreat for bereaved parents that was hosted by David and Nancy Guthrie. Now, many people might know them from the Grief Share videos. And it was in Nashville, Tennessee. And it's funny now, considering we do retreats all the time, but I'm very much an introvert. I'm not a retreat person.
Well, that you sure hide it well.
And so it was way outside my comfort zone to go to that retreat, but we went to it, and there were people there from 11 different states in Canada, and our stories were all very different, but the pain of losing a child is the same. No matter what the circumstance of the child's death, no matter what the age of the child, we bonded with those folks, and it was such a profoundly life-changing experience to go to that retreat that even while we were still there, we began to feel like God might be calling us to do this type of ministry. We knew, Hannah prayed for a storm, that God might use her, and we did not want that storm to go to waste. And so we knew we wanted to do something with it, but we didn't know what. But when we went to that retreat, and it was so profound, it was such a profound experience for us. We knew before we even left there that this was something that we wanted to do. And so we came back home to Arkansas with the idea of doing a retreat. We talked to people that we knew, other people that had lost children. We needed somebody to partner with us.
Yeah.
And God brought us a couple named Larry and Janice Brown who went to our church. We had not really had the occasion to get to know them, but about a year after Hannah went to heaven, their son Adam was killed in action in Afghanistan. He was a member of SEAL Team 6 and has quite a story that anybody can read in the book called Fearless by Eric Blem. And it's quite a story. But again, we went to church with them, but didn't really know them. We sought them out, though, one Sunday. And we said, would you like to come to lunch with us? It was after Adam had died. And they went to lunch with us. And, it would seem that we had nothing in common because our daughter was 17 and died of cancer. Their son was 36 and was killed in the war. But we sat down in this little booth and in a Mexican restaurant, and we started talking, and we were still there 3.5 hours later because even though our stories were so different, we had that common bond of our faith in God and that loss of a child. And we started telling them about this retreat we had been to, and they were all in. The very first time we met them, they said, well, let's do it. And so we started brainstorming about where we might host a retreat. And there's a children's church camp that we knew that the people who run it had lost a son. We got in touch with them. They were all in also. And we hosted our first retreat in April of 2011 at this little church camp. And the accommodations were not very luxurious. It was, like I said, a church camp. So there were bunk rooms. We had a bunk room for men and a bunk room for women, but that first retreat was just amazing. There were 4 couples that came to it, in addition to the 2 of us, and then the people that ran the church camp had lost a son. And it was an amazing experience and just confirmation that we were on the right track with this thing. And so we started doing retreats there at that church camp twice a year, and we did that for 5 years. And in that time, God used that time to grow us, to mature us in our faith and in our grief walk. And we got a website, we got our nonprofit status, and, before long, people were signing up for the retreats, and it was, a 2-year waiting list to get in. And we didn't have to wait that long. And so we started doing them in other areas, but we really recognized that we needed to have our own facility in order to be able to host them as often as we needed to. And God provided to such a degree that we were able to build a retreat center in Hot Springs, Arkansas. Larry and Janice owned a little 3-bedroom, 2-bath house out in the country that they had not lived in a number of years, but they had never sold. And that was the footprint that we started to build from. And I could tell you story after story. It would be way too long of a podcast if I did that. How God provided. And within a year, we had this facility built, and that enabled us to do retreats as often as we needed to. People didn't have to sleep in bunk beds anymore. We had 10 individual bedrooms with private bathrooms and comfortable beds. And with that, we were able to offer these retreats multiple times a year. And God ended up bringing us people who he had uniquely equipped to facilitate retreats like these. A couple from Oregon were the first ones. They came to a retreat, and before they left, they said, God, we feel like God's calling us to do something like this in Oregon. And so they began hosting retreats in Oregon. He brought us another wonderful couple from Maryland. They felt the same thing. God's calling us to do something like this in Maryland. So those were our two first venues, and I honestly can't even tell you the order that God brought to us after that. But we're now hosting retreats in 22 states.
Wow.
He continues to raise up people to lead those retreats. We rent venues in those other areas. This is the only venue that we believe, of course, we can't limit God. This is the only venue we believe right now that we'll ever build, but we rent venues in these other locations, and God has provided to the point where we can rent these venues, and our retreats are free. The very first retreat we ever did, we thought, we actually were advised that we needed to charge something for our retreats so that people would feel invested, that they would have some skin, that they would actually show up, and to cover the expenses. And so we charged for that first retreat, but before it was over, we gave them their money back because we just didn't feel like this was something that God wanted us to charge people for.
Yeah. How cool.
Yeah. And we haven't charged for an event since then. And, God continues to provide for this ministry to the degree that we can host these. Like this coming weekend, we have 3 retreats going on. We have one happening in Georgia, one in Michigan, and one in Maryland. And we're just so honored and privileged that we have the opportunity to do that.
And in case your listeners, if you're wondering, no, Brad and Jill will not be at all 3 of them. Like I thought when Jill first told me about this.
Yeah, we don't own an airplane, or a helicopter to get from one to the other. It's wonderful facilitators who are amazing, who lead all of our retreats.
Yeah. And I think that's something that we really get to see is how God uses his people.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's not about us. It's about him and the Holy Spirit guiding and directing and just people being obedient. And that's been a blessing as we look back. And we say the people God is using, we think, man, they get them and
they're so much better.
They're so much better than us.
God does have a sense of humor too.
That's right.
Well, and this is among the facilitators. We'll talk about a retreat, and they'll say, "How did it go?" And my answer has been, and will continue to be, "Well, it was the best ever."
Right.
How do I differentiate God's goodness?
Yeah. Good point.
And what he does, I can't. And so it's a comedy. We talk about a retreat, the best ever, and and it's just God's goodness, and that's what God does. God gets a group of parents together, and they share their stories, and they encourage each other. What you find out is God brings the people together, and you would think that we do some kind of analytics to bring the right people together. We just let them sign up.
Exactly.
In the connections that they will have, it's just God. It's back to the sovereignty. He's orchestrating that, and we just go, wow. And that's something that we get a glimpse into and get to see, and for that we're grateful.
Yeah, I love that, because if we tried to base it on analytics, we'd screw it all up.
Man, yes,
that's right. So at our retreats, we have mixed groups of all different kinds of loss. We do one specific special kind of retreat, and that is, and we do 8 or 10 of these a year. So retreats that are specifically for parents that have lost children to suicide.
Yeah.
Because we think it's important and valuable for those folks to be able to talk about some things that they may not feel comfortable sharing in a group of mixed loss. Although we have parents that have lost children to suicide come to our mixed groups too, and they do great.
Yeah.
But we just think there's that extra level with those suicide-specific groups, and they are led by facilitators who have lost children to suicide. The people who come and serve have lost children to suicide. I mean, everybody in the building has had that kind of loss, and those are special too. There's also something very special about having a group together where you might have somebody who's lost a child to suicide, a child to cancer, a child to drowning, a child to a car accident, a stillborn baby, all of these different types of loss because an overdose, substance abuse, all of those kinds of things.
Fentanyl is something we see a lot of.
We see a lot of that.
Yeah.
Because we learn compassion for each other. We hear someone else's story and it's like, wow, So there's a lot of value in those mixed groups as well.
Of course. Yeah. Although our grief is different, it's still the same.
Exactly.
That's right.
Yeah, that is so important. I love what you guys are doing. And if you're interested, if you're listening today and you're interested, if you've thought maybe you want to go to a retreat, but you're afraid how much, it might be too expensive, go to their website. Go to Jill and Brad's website while we're waiting and check out the retreats that are available and sign up. It's not going to cost you a penny. And Jill is very humble. She would not say anything about this if I didn't ask, but I want you to tell our listeners about your podcast because I know what it's about, and I think it's a very, very valuable resource.
Yeah, well, thank you. We started the podcast during COVID because, our ministry is completely in-person based.
Right.
We have these retreats that, everybody comes together, and then we do have support groups all around the country too, and people can see that on the website. And, we couldn't even do our support groups. We couldn't do anything where people gather. And so it was like, what can we do where we can still do something for bereaved parents? And, I had plenty of time on my hands. I got on YouTube and watched this whole series of videos of how to start your own podcast. So we started the podcast in July of 2020 and release an episode weekly. It's primarily interview driven because we've been doing retreats for so many years now, and I've had the opportunity to meet so many amazing parents that have lost children. I have the opportunity to talk with them, very similar to what you do, Greg. We talk, they share their child's story, but then we talk about the same things we've been talking about today. How do you deal with a marriage after the loss of a child? What about being a single parent after the loss of a child? Talked to a lot of single parents too. What have you learned about God? How has this impacted your faith? Feel free to share your struggles. Where are you struggling? It's just very real, honest conversations with parents that have lost children to all different types of loss. And it's been a blessing for me. I learn something every interview I do, and you probably do as well.
Indeed, I do.
Yeah.
That's one of the things that I love about it. Just, I'm sure you feel the same way, Jill, that we get to meet some of the most amazing people in the world who have been through the absolute worst that you can imagine, and to hear how God has not only preserved them through it, not only are they surviving, but with Him you can thrive again, as you said earlier in our conversation. And yes, you can find hope again, you can find joy, and you can have a meaningful life. So I'm so glad that you're doing that. And if you guys are listening and you get tired of listening to me, please listen to Jill's podcast. It's called While We're Waiting, Hope After Child Loss. I know that you'll be blessed if you do that. So Brad and Jill, thank you guys so very much for taking the time out of your busy schedules to come and join us today and be my guest on our podcast.
It's been a blessing for us, for sure.
Yes, what a blessing. We're grateful.
Yeah, so am I. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for joining us today. If you would like to offer your thoughts on today's episode, simply click the link under the episode summary. And if you're interested in sharing your story on a future episode, email us using the provided link. Join us again in 2 weeks to hear another story of how God meets us in our pain, creates something beautiful from the broken pieces, and restores meaning, purpose, and hope.